Thank you, Ben Ferencz. Under Lucy Reed's leadership, the ASIL currently has a project a very high-level task force project to think about and make some recommendations about what should be done regarding the future of the ICC. And I have one idea to toss into the hat. It's not original. I credit my legal advisor, Anna Harris, Whitney's wife, for thinking of this yesterday. On January 20th, we're going to have a new president, and he will have a new Secretary of State, etc. And I hope these people sit down with these men and listen to some of the wisdom that we've heard today.
Me too.
With our remaining time, which unfortunately is finite, I turn the floor open to you. I'd ask for your concise questions, and I'll ask these men to sort of be relatively brief in answers so we all have a chance to participate in the dialogue. Ma'am, blue shirt, second row.
First question, how many?
No, second row, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Let her in.
Next blue shirt will be you.
I'd like to know how this group and these committees work as opposed to the International Court at The Hague. Are you part of the same group? Do you cooperate, or are you separate entities?
How does the
Are you separate entities from the court at The Hague?
Right. At The Hague is the home of a number of international justice institutions, including the International Court of Justice, which is a civil body, the so-called World Court, the International Criminal Court, which is a permanent treaty-based body that is subscribed to by over 100 nations, and a number of other special tribunals, including the Yugoslavia Tribunal. Other locations are the homes of the Rwanda Tribunal, the Sierra Leone, the Cambodia Tribunal, and so forth. And Nuremberg, of course, was an early ad hoc, as we would call it, creation. So these are all cousins in a landscape of international institutions. The one that will last is the International Criminal Court. That is the permanent one. That will be, if you saw a map that would have the shaded countries. There is one in a display at the Jackson Center of the nations of the world that have ratified the ICC Charter. You see the map filling in. Some big non-signatories like Russia, China, and the United States, but it is coming to be, and it will always be, as I can foresee it, the International Criminal Court. So that's how they fit together. Ma'am, your question.
I'm interested in knowing if anyone can tell us how many peace academies there are in the world, in our country, and more importantly, I'm really curious about your frame of mind as you accepted the daunting task in your youth to adjudicate at the Nuremberg courts. Was it fear and trepidation? How you were so young?
Let me repeat the question. It had two good parts. The question asked about the state of mind and the fear and trepidation, perhaps, that these then young lawyers had as they took on this Nuremberg work in 1945, 1946. Second question was about institutes or academies studying peace rather than war.
Well, I think
Henry?
that I think on that one, you have to be willing to take a chance, and you have to. I had training from my father, who was in politics. He said that you ought to tithe for humanity a bit. There are too many takers in civilization. There are not enough givers. That somebody had to put something into the pot to create a better world for future generations. So I think idealism also I got at the Yale Law School, where they seem to take the socially desirable result and work backwards. So I was ready for Nuremberg in that case. But I think that somehow you have to instill in people what's important in life, and that you're not just one person on earth, that there are future generations who live in a better world. So it's idealism, and that's fulfilling, particularly at this point in life. And it's wonderful to keep your eyes in the future and on the stars. Thank you.
Whitney or Ben, your state of mind as you began this work?
Well, I was going to say they picked me for my size and my beauty and my
Use
youth.
the microphone, Ben, please.
I better not use the mic for that, they'll hit me. Well, it's largely, my wife would say fate. I think it's chance. But it so happened that I was the most experienced man in the world and the most knowledgeable man in the world at the time I was given that responsibility. My knowledge came from having been the research assistant to a professor at Harvard who wrote a book on war crimes, which I did the research. I'd read every book in the Harvard Law Library which had to do with war crimes. My experience in the Army as a war crimes investigator, going into the camps, capturing the evidence, interrogating the criminals, was also unmatchable. Then I was in charge of the office in Berlin, which had to collect evidence for all of the trials, and I had a staff of about 50 people doing that. And I had to screen the evidence and set it down. So when we came upon this complete set of the Einsatzgruppen reports, I brought it down to Telford Taylor, who was a general at the time, chief of counsel, and I said, we have to put on a new trial. He said, we hadn't planned a new trial, we don't have staff. And, you know, budget and Pentagon and all that. And I said, we just can't let these guys go. We had Ollendorf's statement, we had Ollendorf in the can, as we called it. And he said, well, can you do it in addition to your other work? And I said, sure. And so he said, okay, you're the chief prosecutor. So I became the chief prosecutor of the biggest murder trial in human history. I was 27 years old. It was my first criminal case. It was my only criminal case in my life. I arrested the case after 2 days. I didn't have enough brains to call witnesses. I said, I don't need them. And I convicted all the defendants on their own affidavits with 13 death sentences. It was a historic conclusion by a totally immature, young, perhaps incompetent young man, but I did it.
Whitney, you were a young OSS officer, kind of hanging around London when you hitched onto this Nuremberg project. What was your state of mind?
Well, first of all, I was practicing law in Los Angeles when the war broke out. Unfortunately for me, I was not married at that time. So I realized that, you know, I was going to have to take care of myself. Matter of fact, my senior law partner tipped me off to this. He was very hard of hearing. He called me up on December 7th, 1941, which was a Saturday. He said, Whitney, he says, the Japs have just bombed Pearl Harbor. I said, well, Mr. Goodspeed, thank you very much. And completely dismissed his statement, thinking that he had misheard, you know, what the broadcast was. But when it proved to be true, then I scurried around and finally got myself a commission as an ensign in the United States Navy, and served in the Navy throughout the war, except at the very end of the war, the Navy transferred me to OSS and Office of Strategic Services, and OSS then, after some training, sent me to Europe in charge of the investigation of war crimes for OSS, and I set up my headquarters down on St. James, close by British intelligence, and there did my work for OSS and collecting as many incriminating documents as I could, most of which I obtained from British intelligence, turned them over to Justice Jackson's office, which had just been established there in London, and in that way they were very glad to see me because they had no evidence, and these documents were very helpful to them. Colonel Story, who was Jackson's assistant, did the same thing in Paris for the American Expeditionary Forces there. He collected evidence through the Army, captured documents, of course, and then when we got to Nuremberg, we set up a document center and put all these German documents into the center, and we were able to obtain some very brilliant individuals who translated thousands of these documents that ultimately turned out into English, and other languages which were used in the court, so that we had this tremendous volume of documentary evidence which was incriminating to the Germans. My chief, Bill Donovan, General Donovan of OSS, was supposed to be Justice Jackson's top assistant. He came to Nuremberg a little bit late, and by that time, Jackson realized that we were going to be able to prove the case against the Germans through documentary evidence. Now, this was very important because in history, the documents cannot be changed. The statement of witnesses can be denied and challenged in history, but documentary evidence cannot be. So Justice Jackson had made the decision that we would proceed as far as we could with our case with documentary evidence. And General Donovan then, when he came to Nuremberg, found that that decision had been made, and he returned to the United States. But he left me behind.
Other questions? Sir, Steve.
John, really not a question, but on behalf of everybody here, specifically the three gentlemen in the dais, excuse me, and Ray, Bill, and Don, who have attended this function, I think they deserve a standing ovation for their work for the last 63 years, especially for international law.
I promise we're going to do that, but save your knees, and we're going to do that at the end, okay? Because I wholly agree. If you've noticed, I'm already standing. I'm clapping softly, but that is coming. Other questions from the audience? Could I pose one to you, gentlemen? We've heard the name Raphael Lemkin, and history credits him as the father of the Genocide Convention. He was a Polish lawyer, a refugee, a U.S. government consultant, an employee in various capacities, and then came back on the European scene and was in and about London and Nuremberg during the times you were there. Did you know him? Did you see him? Do you have memories of Lemkin to share with us? Henry?
Yeah, I knew Raphael Lemkin. He was always bothering me outside the Grand Hotel. He was unkempt looking. He was unshaven, had wild hair. And finally I got wary of going into the hotel, which I had to go to for meetings. And he had a concern about the fact that the judgment covered only wartime genocide, not peacetime genocide. And he wanted me to do what I could to change it. Well, they did change it in Control Council Law number 10, where they covered peacetime genocide as well as wartime. That was the basis for the trial of the defendants in the subsequent proceedings. And he also got a resolution passed by the UN to condemn genocide on December 14th, 1946, which is the same date they endorsed the Nuremberg Principles. At the same time, he also was the author, largely, of the Genocide Convention, which became law in 1961, or was signed in 1961. And he made a magnificent contribution, so you can't tell a book by its cover. But I remember he's a good example of a person, an individual, who wanted to change the face of the world and who did so. Very persistent. And he published a book in 1944, just around the time of just before the Nuremberg trial. And he got indictment and genocide mentioned in the indictment on August 16, 1945, of the defendants at Nuremberg. So he's a hero to my way of thinking. And he published very good article, reasons for endorsing genocide, namely the diversity of peoples, that every group of people makes some contribution to the progress of civilization. That's very important. Cited the Greeks, the Romans, the Poles, and the Czechs and the Jewish people also. So I have good memories of my contact with him, but I wish I'd given him I had always regretted that I didn't have a comb to help him, to help him with his hair. Thank you.
Ben?
I also knew Raphael Lemkin. My observations were similar to Henry's in many respects. He was a traumatized man. His entire family, I don't remember the exact number, probably 74 or something like that, had been exterminated by the Nazis. He went around pleading, saying, look, there has to be a special name for this. They killed my entire family. They didn't even know them. They killed them just because they were Jews. You can't, it's not just plain murder. There's got to be a name for that, a different name for it. And he was a scholarly man. He put together genus and side. Unless you have suicide, you have killing of a whole group. And so he said, we have to give this a special name. And he was very persistent. He was rather unkempt. He came to me in my official capacity. At that time, I was executive counsel to General Taylor, handling questions of housekeeping and so on, and assignment of staff. He was attached somehow to the Polish delegation, but he had no official status with them because he always needed something. And I had to get him a pass, and I always gave him something, as I did to other groups of victims who came and needed help. Logistically, at that time in Germany, everything was controlled by the army. There was no food, there was no housing, there was no currency. Cigarettes were the currency of the day. And he gave me a copy of his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Territories, a very scholarly book. And he then came to the United States, where he was working on trying to get the Genocide Convention accepted in the United Nations. And he was working together with the man who I think invented the idea of an international criminal court. And that was a Romanian diplomat by the name of Vespasian Pella, who had written a book on counterfeiting, and then there was nobody to try counterfeiters, and he said, we need an international court to deal with that crime. So the two of them, aided by scholars from Lithuania, the Robinson brothers, Jacob Robinson and Nehemiah Robinson, were working on drafting the convention and trying to get it through the United Nations. And he was not married. He had no children of his own. He had a brother living in New York, and the brother had a nephew. And Raphael Lemkin is buried in a cemetery in Long Island with a simple stone, identifying him as the father of the Genocide Convention. And I share your opinion. It was the role of what one persistent individual can do. If he's got a right, if he's right and continues to press it despite the opposition. And so he's been a model, he and other people. There are many people I could name the same way. The guy, since it's the humanitarian conference here, René Cassin, he sat down, he was a refugee lawyer from Paris, retreated to London with General de Gaulle. He sat down one day and with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt's politics, drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I always carry it in my bag. I can get it with my eyes shut, the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one individual. And then you have the same thing with the law of the sea. Alvin Pardo came from Malta. He said, the seabed should belong to everybody. It's common heritage of mankind. It doesn't belong to one person or another, and so on. In history, you have the whole environmental stuff, because, you know, Silent Spring of a woman who said the birds are not singing. There's something wrong with the environment. So one individual can make a difference. You may have to be a little bit crazy and a little bit unkempt, but if you persist and you're right, don't give up. You'll be surprised you might make it.
Whitney, do you have memories of Lemkin?
Well, I only had this one thought. You've all explained it, Raphael Lemkin, very well, but the word was new, genocide, but the concept was not. For as early as 1933, think of this, Lemkin had submitted to the International Conference for the Unification of Criminal Law a proposal to establish as a crime of barbarity under the law of nations the destruction of racial, religious, or social groups. Reports of the deliberate murder of the Jews of Europe added urgency to the recognition of this hideous crime.
I'd like to add something. Can I add
Please.
something which I forgot? In the opening statement of the Einsatzgruppen trial, this was a classic case of genocide. Their instructions were kill all the Jews because they are Jews, period. Gypsies the same. In the opening statement, I made reference to the fact that I used the term genocide. I said this was a case of classic genocide. So I think that's one of the earliest times when the term was used in the actual presentation of the case.
Other questions, Lucy? Right, I did note that. Do any of you have information, or perhaps another human rights expert in the audience can give us some quantitative information about the study of peace, the training in the pursuit of peace in academies, institutes, domestically and I guess internationally?
I can, well, I've studied peace a long time. There's a lot of people who have been studying peace for a long time. As a matter of fact, it's from time immemorial. So after the First World War, which was quite a horrible war, nothing compared to the Second really, but women's groups, there was a publication I had, must have had 500 different women's groups, Women for Peace, different organizations, all of them. And anybody who studies the history of any nation will have to study the history of the war of that nation. Usually they present their own country in heroic terms without stressing the horrors of war. But that's also changing. So your question doesn't have a very simple answer unless you want to do total research and look at the computer and plug into whatever it is that you have to get it. But certainly there are an infinite number of books on the causes of war and how to get rid of war. You just have to go to any library and you'll have more than you'll have time to read.
Sir.
We hear about Nuremberg, and we don't hear much about, we hear about Nuremberg, but we don't hear much about, on the other side of the ocean, the Japanese. We see the battleship, we see the surrender. Did any of you get involved or as advisors, or were you ever consulted about anything that was done with the trials for the Japanese?
The question is, what about the Far East? And were any of you consulted or involved in any way with the war criminals processes following the Japanese surrender?
I was not.
Well, the Japanese trial, of course, they had more judges than we did, but they followed the Nuremberg precedent faithfully, and we count on the Japanese trial as an affirmation of the principles of law which were approved at Nuremberg.
One more point on that. The Japanese recently ratified or signed the convention for the statute for the International Criminal Court, and a Japanese woman was elected a judge of the ICC.
Other questions, ma'am? Or let me get a new voice in the conversation. Ma'am in the front row. Thank you. Please. Yes.
Where is the United States on the International Criminal Court? Was there?
The question is, where is the United States on the International Criminal Court? I won't be flippant. I'll defer to my senior experts.
Well, we signed the treaty the last night of President Clinton's reign, and then Bush unsigned it, which was very unusual. We're not anywhere. No, I think this is, you're getting at the problem that we talk to ourselves. We've got to sell Congress and the executive branch on what's right. We need to tell them what's right. It should be, as I said this morning, a legal agenda for peace before Congress, to sloganeer it. But the important thing is that the focus on issues, big issues, will shift from the United States to Europe, where most nations have ratified the International Criminal Court. So we want to play a role. They're considering the question of aggression at the present time with the Assembly of States, a committee trying to draft a definition of aggression. We're not allowed to participate, That's the important thing. So I say that the world is passing us by, and we can kid ourselves with what tiny progress we're making, but I think the important thing is the big issues. The United States, which has had dreams in the past, particularly under Justice Jackson, can be a leader in the world instead of a follower. So it's very important that we note what we haven't done, and we haven't done a number of treaties. And the Senate's requirement for 2/3 approval of passage of treaties is at this time a handicap. So the world is our beat, but we've got to take steps from the progress that's been made to create a more secure peace in the world so that all nations are participating. And I think we can do it.
The three of us were at the Rome conference, and of course, we're very strong supporters of the United States joining the treaty. And there will be a conference held next year on questions of what our position of possible amendments to the treaty. One of the things that we're concerned about was aggression. The aggression was left out of the treaty up to the last moment because agreement could not be reached among the delegates on the definition of aggression. I don't have any trouble with that. It's very simple, but the delegates couldn't agree upon it. And so fortunately for us, at the last moment, the Hans-Peter Kaul for the German delegation came up with the idea, well, let's not worry about the definition, let's put aggression in the treaty subject to subsequent definition. And that is what has happened. So now we have the daunting problem facing us of finding a suitable definition for aggression. And that has got to be done for the safety of mankind. It must be done.
Let me answer your question. Question is, where's the United States now? I explained, or tried to, that there are differences of opinion in every democracy. There are differences of opinion in the United States on the subject of whether we should surrender any of our rights to any foreign court. There is a sizable body of opinion which says the answer to that question is no. Jesse Helms, the late, departed, was a champion of that. He said, "Oh, for my dead body." Well, he's died in the meanwhile, and he expressed that point of view, which was a serious point of view for a large number of the American constituency. And as Henry mentioned en passant, you need 2/3 of the American Senate to ratify a treaty before it becomes binding. There was no way in a conservative country frightened by the threat of terrorism and nuclear bombs that they were going to surrender any part of American sovereignty to a foreign court. So Clinton recognized that, but having his signature put onto this thing indicated, in principle, they were in favor. Bush, and appealing to his conservative constituency, says, "Oh, no way." Bolton went and he erased it. Now Bolton has been erased from his job. So things keep changing. And there is some hope that there will be some change in the future, but it won't be easy. It took 40 years to ratify the Genocide Convention, which was easy compared to aggression. Now, on the aggression, let me take a minute or two because
just one, so we
1
stay.
minute. Look at my website. My name is www.benferenz.org. You will find there references to many volumes that I have written on that subject, and hundreds of articles and dozens of speeches. I'll give you all the details. The gist of it in one sentence is simply, we don't need a definition of aggression. Justice Jackson didn't need a definition of aggression, neither did the International Law Commission, and they don't need it now. That's an excuse put in to avoid subjecting themselves to the jurisdiction of any court. As long as that happens, you're in deadly danger. Good luck.
I find myself, and this isn't a new realization, very much with Henry King's late wife. As we're studying and talking about intensely, there's a world out there. And the better life, the higher life is one that gets involved with it, that is part of it, that works on it. We're not going to do it for our posterity. It's going to be theirs in the end. We'll hand it off to them, and then it's their problem to work for their posterity. But that higher path is the one that these men have taken, and it is very inspiring to learn from them. Please join me in thanking Whitney Harris, Henry King, and Ben Ferencz.